Oh, that's right. DM and the PM, baby.
Welcome, all you Dungeon Masters, to DM in the PM, the show that, for better or for worse, is a lot less sexually charged than the intro might suggest. But stick around, we've got a whole bunch of great D&D and Dungeon Master-related content for you guys. My name's Tom Quinn, resident Dungeon Master here at Modern Myth, and this is a continuation of the series that we call the Building Blocks of a Campaign. And today's topic is going to be contrast. Contrast is one of our most important tools in governing the experience at the table, in that it's the fundamental vehicle by which we communicate pacing. No doubt there have been times where you've finished out a session and you're packing your things up and you're kind of going, that felt a little more stale than usual, versus those times when you're packing up your session and you're going, man, that was a banger. That was whatever was going on there. That's exactly what I want to see out of future sessions. That's really where we get into kind of those elements of contrast. I think you will find when you look back at sessions that really felt like they had a strong pacing, that you get to the end of the session and everyone wishes you could have 2 more hours. The difference in those tends to be the texture, if you will, of a given session. Those snappy, really hyped up sessions, oftentimes you will find that you had some great social encounters mixed in with some awesome combat. Maybe there was some very simple tasks at their disposal contrasted against some very difficult ones. The contrast between these experiences that they're having at the table ultimately translates as the pacing, the momentum of a session. So let's talk about some of the varieties of experiences that we bring to the table as DMs that ultimately lend to the contrast. Another term, I guess, that might be worth utilizing here is the texture of that experience at the table. The larger variety of textures that can be encompassed within a given gaming session ultimately communicates a faster pace. Not always, but that's a good way of thinking about it. Let's talk about the different variables at our disposal when introducing more texture or more contrast into our game space. So these are going to be elements like combat versus social versus traps versus puzzles. Those are kind of the very tangible elements that we can add to our game. Not to mention things like chase sequences, defense sequences versus offensive sequences. So it's kind of a variety of different encounter types that can really challenge our playgroup. And a broad variety of those will lend itself to kind of a snappy pace, something that feels like the game is moving along and the players are getting a lot done and a lot of bang for their buck, if you will. But there's a lot of modifiers onto even these kind of core entries into the game world. That would be things like the difficulty of an encounter, creating a lot of contrast in the difficulty of things. There should be times where your players find themselves in situations that are beneath them, that they simply move through. And the nice part is by injecting the contrast of difficulty into your combat encounters, or really any of your encounter types, you can build a lot of momentum, a lot of pacing at the table by providing the party with a few tasks that are maybe on the easier end of the spectrum. Really rewards them by way of contrast when they hit an encounter that really does challenge them. If every encounter they come across represents the peak level of challenge that the party is currently prepared to handle, you rapidly begin to lose texture, and it simply feels like the world around them is scaling directly in line with their accomplishments. This does very little by way of conveying the strides that they've taken as players. So difficulty is a really important lever that we can pull with regard to generating contrast in the game space. Piggybacking off of difficulty is the contrast between tension and relaxation. And more often than not, you'll find that those go hand in hand. The more difficult something is, the more tension you're able to build. Though there are many times where you can circumvent that in other ways. You can build all sorts of narrative tension into a space that really is untethered to the difficulty of the scenario. A great way of thinking about contrast relative to pacing at the table is to kind of envision it as a sliding scale, where as you build tension into the game space, you have an effect that is something akin to dilation of time, an expanding of the pacing within the game space. So as you build that tension, and that can be a very powerful tool when you need your players kind of hanging on a moment, prepared for combat to erupt, prepared for that big climactic resolution to whatever it is you've been working towards. So that's one half of that scale, is building tension, ultimately resulting in a dilation of time, or the experience of time within the game world. Conversely, easing that tension can often have the opposite effect. But more importantly is the relationship between shifting from one to the other. What really conveys pacing at the table is a movement into a space of tension where you allow that dilation to build, and then the catharsis of relaxation, of the exhale. Those little arcs really tend to mimic, whether it's over the course of a single combat, over the course of an entire adventure hook, over the course of an entire campaign, those little arcs where we are building tension and releasing it, building tension and releasing it, ultimately pays off in the eyes of DMs running the game, as well as the players at the table, as pace. Things are moving forward. We are building these resolution loops, so to speak, into the game space. And combat, it is no different than any other aspect of the game, in that even though in your character's experience, combat should be the most frenetic, exciting aspect of any game. Horrifying is maybe substitutable for exciting, but that's not always the experience of the players at the table. The players can certainly begin to experience a fatigue of lack of contrast, quite frankly. So a great consideration with regard to contrast is to splice multiple textures into a single interaction, into a single encounter. And what I mean by that, and I'm sure many of you are already doing this, this is no grand revelation by any means, but the difference between a combat encounter, for instance, that also contains an environmental hazard, a combat encounter that also contains a trap, a puzzle that is on the clock because there is some impending doom in not solving it. The splicing of these textures almost immediately takes the pacing up by another level or two or three. This layering of textures within a single encounter, I cannot recommend highly enough. If you are finding that maybe some of your sessions, maybe some of your encounters are falling a little flat, find a second texture that really complements an encounter that you've worked up, and find a way that those two can hold hands within that same space. And it's amazing how much contrast and pacing you can lend to an otherwise hack and slash combat encounter by placing that combat encounter on the side of a mountain that is in the midst of a rock slide, or in the midst of collapse of the land bridge. A great exercise that I like to use when I'm reflecting on my sessions, both those that went really well and those that maybe didn't land quite as hard as I would have liked them to, is to simply go back and kind of bullet point out what transpired during the session. And then looking at each of those components, kind of assess or analyze what texture they brought to the session. And more often than not, I find if it was a session that landed a little bit flat, there's a good chance that too many of the things on those lists shared a similar texture. I didn't provide enough switching of gears for my players to convey a sense of momentum, to convey a sense of motion moving forward through the narrative, or even just moving forward through a given aspect of the game. Conversely, those sessions that really always seem to land really well, where people get up and you can feel an energy, a readiness to sit down and play the next session. Overwhelmingly, those are sessions where I've found opportunity to inject a broad variety of encounter types, and within those encounter types, a broad variety of difficulties, of motivations, of incentives, of consequences. And that really does segue us into another aspect of contrast. And that contrast it really piggybacks on the prior episodes that we've done in this series. So that's going to be our motivations as well as our incentives and our consequences. So as far as motivation is concerned, it's really important if you, I think especially if you are interested in building out a kind of a very narrative-centric game space, that those people who are in opposition to your party are in opposition for a broad variety of reasons. So this is a contrast of the motivation of the characters within your game space. If every villain that the heroes come across are fundamentally motivated by the need to be evil, they simply want to hurt those around them, and there's certainly space for villains like these. You can have villains who are just utterly bad. The nice part is a villain like that carries the texture of there is no negotiating with this villain. There's no understanding their point of view. If your party is fundamentally good, there is no way that these two entities can reconcile. Conversely, though, some of the most compelling villains, certainly in other narrative enterprises, but I would say this can be the case at your game table as well, are ones where by the time the party has completed the tasks necessary to be standing before this villain, ready to bring them to justice, it's quite possible that the party has come to find that their motivations aren't entirely out of sync with this individual, or at least they can empathize with why this individual may have been acting the way that they do. And that's a very interesting space for your party to exist in. But the key there is that there is contrast between those motivations. Just as every villain being horrific and evil for the sake of being horrific and evil, it can be a bit fatiguing if every time you get to that big final encounter with the boss, you only feel half justified in killing them, or maybe even sympathize with their position and opt to not bring them to the justice you intended to. That can also have its own fatigue associated with it. So creating a variety of motivations, not just for your villains, but for all aspects of your game, really starts to lend itself to a believable world in which people are functioning for contrasting reasons. Another really important contrast of motivation is that of your players. Whereas most characters that have been created do have their own fundamental motivations, those motivations still are likely pretty broad, and tapping into a variety of motivations that your players have really does drive the party in different ways. So be thinking about the ways in which you can speak to an individual player or an individual character differently than maybe you've motivated them in the past or incentivized them in the past. If every time you dangle a carrot in front of one of your players, it's that same drive forward, what are you planning on doing as a DM when they finally have that carrot in hand? So being cognizant of what the different pushes and pulls are for your own characters, or you should say your own players' motivations, is a really, really important consideration. Making a conscious decision to incentivize those players through a variety or a broad contrast of the motivations that really drive those characters forward. In episode 2, we talked about incentives and consequences. There's a variety of ways in which contrast can be applied to these. We talked a little bit about the scale of incentives and consequences, kind of the weight of those consequences, and that's a great way which you can provide contrast. Sometimes the party messes up, and sometimes all they need is a little slap on the wrist. That's a very reasonable consequence, but that should be contrasted against mess-ups that really cost the party something, that leave them reeling, that leave them on edge for potential future consequences. In addition to the scale of incentives and consequences, we can also consider proximity of those consequences relative to the party as being another lever of contrast that we can utilize in the game space. And what I mean by that is a consequence or incentive could be that one of the party members has been cursed. That proximity is ground zero. One of the party members is experiencing a consequence, or you could view it as is being incentivized to remove this curse. That could be the entire party who feels incentivized to help their companion in doing so. But beyond that, you could have a consequence or an incentive that lands a bit further afield from the party. For instance, an NPC that they know well, their life could be hanging in the balance, and the incentive or consequence isn't directly with the party themselves, but with someone the party cares about. This is another great example of the way in which you can build contrast into these other aspects of the game that we've talked about in prior episodes. In virtually all of the episodes in this series, we've talked about scaling and the way in which scaling kind of applies differently to each of the aspects in the game space. Scaling could be best described relative to contrast at the rate at which you are transitioning from one texture to another. And ultimately, the more aggressively that you are transitioning from one texture in the world space to another, that effectively reads as pacing. You're building energy in that transition between the contrasting elements in your game world. And that is not a call to, as rapidly as possible, move from one contrasting element to another to another. There is an element of finesse, and I think that finesse is ultimately governed narratively within the space. If you're playing a game that is not tethered to a narrative ultimately, or is lightly tethered to a narrative, you may find that those contrast transitions really don't need to be hindered or governed by the narrative in any way. But ultimately, I think in the interest of telling compelling stories, there is something to be said for a formula that really exists in the way in which we as humans want to consume narratives. And that really ties well into our next episode, which is going to be structure. And we're not going to go too deep into that because structure really is kind of the mortar that's going to hold all of these components together. But suffice it to say, the structure of a narrative ultimately serves as a really strong template for when we should be using contrast to build tension, when we should be using contrast to relieve tension, as well as all of the other components we've talked about: motivation, incentives, consequences. So that's a great segue, but we will ultimately save that for next episode. That's about all I have on contrast and the importance of utilizing contrast to really drive the pace of your game, to make those sessions really light on fire so that by the time you're getting to the end, people are going, when do we play again? Can we play for another hour? Let's just go a little bit further. Everyone, I'm sure, who's run the game has gotten to the end of those sessions where everyone is so hyped to play. Nothing feels better as a DM than finding yourself in that space where people are just begging for just a little bit more, just 10 more minutes. So hopefully contrast, or thinking about contrast in this way, will help you to add a little bit more pacing, or control the pacing, structure the pacing inside your own game a little bit more efficiently. And even just as a tool to analyze those sessions, I certainly still find myself having sessions where I go, man, I saw that playing out a little more rapid fire in my head. And it's just a great exercise for me to be able to go back and analyze what could I have done different by way of contrast to really drive that session to the level of pacing that I wanted to see it play out at. I would love to hear down in the comments all your thoughts on pacing in general, but talk with me a little bit about contrast, your thoughts on contrast, how you are implementing these variety of textures in the tapestry of your game world, your own tips and tricks. I always love to hear them, guys. Any other thoughts you may have down in the comments. I'm looking at those regularly, and we really do appreciate your guys' participation. I really do want this to be a two-way space where DMs down in the comments can engage with one another, certainly engage with myself. So keep those comments coming. We love them, guys. Beyond that, if you got anything out of this video, hit that subscribe button, the like, the little notification bell. You guys know what to do. You're pros at this. It really does help us out. I can't overstate how much the few clicks does as far as letting us know that you guys are liking the content, that you guys want to see more, and also telling the YouTube overlords that more people need to be checking out DM in the PM and everything else that we're doing here at Modern Myth. I will catch you guys next time for Structure, our fourth and final episode in the series. But until then, the world is yours.